The city used to have a skyline. Chicago's towers still stood, most of them, but standing and alive were different things now. The glass had gone first, blown out by barren shock waves or demon siege fire, leaving the buildings as hollow ribs of steel and concrete jutting against a sky the color of a bruise. The cloud cover never broke anymore. Something in hell's atmosphere, the UAC scientists said before most of them died, had altered the upper stratosphere. The sun existed somewhere above that permanent orange-brown ceiling. Most days it was hard to believe. John Wick landed badly. The teleporter, if that's what it was, deposited him 6 feet above street level. He hit the cracked asphalt shoulder first, rolled on pure reflex, came up in a crouch with the Glock already in his hand and his eyes already moving. Threat assessment, exit routes, cover positions. His body ran the checklist before his mind finished catching up to the fact that he was no longer where he'd been standing 3 seconds ago. He'd been in what remained of a community center in rural Montana. 43 survivors, 12 armed. Demon raid incoming from the northern ridge. A standard imp and possessed wave, the kind that had become grimly routine in the 18 months since the sky cracked open and the world learned that hell was not a metaphor. He'd been positioning shooters, conserving ammunition, calculating which doorways could be held and which needed to be abandoned. And then the UAC emergency relay in the basement, a relic nobody knew how to operate, had sparked to life, grabbed him by the molecular structure, and moved him. The street he crouched on now was not Montana, and the buildings were wrong. Too tall, too urban, too gutted. Something large had walked through this block recently. Recently meaning days, not months. The claw gouges in the asphalt were each 3 feet wide and pressed 6 inches deep into the road surface. Whatever made them weighed things that John Wick didn't have a unit of measurement for. A yellow taxi lay on its roof 40 feet away, folded nearly in half. The fire hydrant next to it had been sheared clean off at the base and was nowhere visible. He stood slowly, kept the Glock up, listened. Chicago smelled like sulfur and copper and something underneath both of those. Something organic and wrong, like the entire city's infrastructure had been threaded through with living tissue. The wind moved through the empty street and carried with it a distant sound. Low, rhythmic. It's almost like chanting, except the register was too deep for human throats. John Wick had spent his entire adult life in rooms full of dangerous things. He had developed, over those decades, a very specific and reliable internal instrument. Not quite fear, more like a calibration. A reading of how much danger occupied the air around him at any given moment. He trusted this instrument more than almost anything else. Right now, it was reading very high. He moved to the taxi, used it for cover, and did a slow 360 scan of the street. Empty, visually. But the smell was getting stronger from the east, and now he could hear secondary sounds beneath the chanting, a wet, tearing quality to the ambient noise that experience told him meant something was feeding. He checked his loadout. Glock 34 with 1 full magazine and 11 rounds in the current. The Kimber 1911 on his hip with 8. The folding knife at his ankle. He'd been expecting a demon wave in Montana, so he'd gone in armed, but not heavily. In the current world, ammunition was the limiting factor on everything. You shot what you needed to stop, and you stopped exactly when the target stopped. He heard the thing before he saw it. It came around the corner of what had been a Walgreens. An imp, though John Wick didn't have that word yet. He had category, bipedal, roughly humanoid in silhouette, moving with the low-slung forward lean of something that had evolved to chase. It was on fire, or made of fire, or fire was simply part of its biology in the way that skin was part of his. It spotted him the same instant he spotted it and made a sound like tearing sheet metal. John Wick shot it twice in the head. It stumbled, didn't stop. He shot it twice more in the same location, adjusting the angle slightly downward on the second pair. The thing went down, twitching, and then went still. 4 rounds. He stood over it for exactly 2 seconds, confirming stillness, then moved. Behind the fallen imp, 3 more rounded the corner. He ran the math in real time. 23 rounds total across both weapons. 3 targets requiring a minimum of 4 rounds each based on the sample size of 1, plus unknown variables, plus whatever was making that feeding sound to the east. He needed cover, elevation, and ideally more ammunition in that order. He found a stairwell door in the building to his left. Locked. He shot the lock, moved inside, took the stairs up 3 at a time. Behind him, the imps hit the street door and started tearing it apart rather than processing the concept of a handle. He had maybe 20 seconds. 3rd floor window overlooking the street. He broke the glass with his elbow, leaned out, and shot all 3 imps in the top of the skull as they clustered at the door below him. 11 rounds total for the 4 of them. Inefficient. He needed to understand the biology better before he could optimize. He needed ammunition. He needed a map. He needed to understand where he was and what the rules were. John Wick had survived his entire life by understanding rules. The rules of the underworld, the rules of violence, the rules that governed what men did to each other in dark places. Every world had rules, even this one. He just needed to find them. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Rip and tear until it is done. He checked the Glock's magazine, then moved deeper into the building, away from the street. Somewhere to the north, something enormous let out a sound that shook the floor beneath his feet. Not anger, not hunger, something worse. The casual noise of a thing that didn't know it was supposed to be afraid of anything. John Wick moved toward it anyway. That had always been his particular problem. He found them on the 7th floor of what had been a law firm. The signs were professional. Not military, not UAC, but the improvised kind that came from people who had survived long enough to develop protocols. A strip of red tape across a stairwell door at the 5th floor with a hand-painted X. A fishing line strung across the 6th floor landing with tin cans threaded through it. Primitive, effective, the kind of alarm system that worked because it required no power and no maintenance. On the 7th floor door itself, scratched into the metal with something sharp. Knock 3. Wait, knock 2. John Wick knocked 3. Waited, knocked 2. Silence for 10 seconds. Then the sound of a heavy piece of furniture being dragged across linoleum. The door opened 4 inches, stopped by a chain, and a single eye regarded him from the gap. A female, middle-aged, carrying the particular expression of someone who had renegotiated their relationship with trust several months ago and arrived at a number very close to 0. "You're not possessed," she said. It wasn't a question. Possessed humans moved wrong. Something in the demonic integration disrupted fine motor control, produced a gait that survivors learned to recognize from a distance. John Wick was moving correctly. "No," he said. "Where'd you come from? We didn't hear you on the stairs until you were already at the door." "Montana. Before that, New York." The eye moved to his hands, his weapon, his clothes. "You know how to use that?" "Yes." Another pause. The eye did a longer assessment, the kind that was reading things beyond the obvious. John Wick had been assessed by professionals his entire career. And this woman wasn't a professional, but she'd developed the instinct through necessity, which in some ways was more reliable. She was reading his posture, his stillness, the way he held the Glock. Low, relaxed, with the particular ease of someone who'd carried a firearm for so long it had stopped being an object and become an extension. The chain came off. The door opened. There were 11 of them. The law firm's interior had been stripped of everything combustible and reorganized into a single, large central space. Desks pushed to the walls and loaded with supplies. Sleeping areas partitioned with cubicle dividers, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding 12 blocks, covering most of one glass wall with notations in 4 different colors of marker. Red for demon patrol routes, blue for supply caches, green for confirmed clear routes, and black for the locations where people hadn't come back from. There was a lot of black. The woman's name was Carla. She'd been a public defender. The group included 2 teenagers, a retired electrician named Moss who'd lost 3 fingers on his left hand to an imp 2 weeks ago and was managing the wound with antiseptic and determination. A former Chicago PD officer named Reyes, who had a shotgun and the hollow eyes of someone who'd used it more than she'd expected to, and 7 others in various states of physical and psychological repair. They fed him. Canned soup heated on a camp stove with the ventilation carefully managed. Demon heat signatures tracked by smell as much as sight, and cooking odors carried. While he ate, Carla talked. The UAC complex outside the city, ARC they call it. That's the only organized resistance we know of within 200 miles. They broadcast on a military frequency twice a day. Resource drops occasionally. Mostly instructions to stay hidden and stay quiet. She paused. There's also him. John Wick looked up. Reyes answered instead. The Slayer. That's what people call him. Big, green armor. He moves through demon concentrations like... She stopped, looking for the right comparison and not finding one. He doesn't go around them. He goes through them. We've seen him twice from a distance. The second time he walked into a baron of hell. You know what that is. I've seen them from far away. He walked into one and came out the other side. The baron didn't. Reyes's voice carried something complicated. Not quite reverence, closer to the feeling you got standing next to a natural phenomenon. He doesn't stop. He doesn't slow down. He doesn't talk. He just moves, and everything demonic dies. John Wick filed this away. Someone operating with extreme effectiveness in this environment. Relevant data. What does he want? Wick asked. We don't know, Carla said. He doesn't communicate. He killed a demon siege that was about to overrun a survivor group in the South Loop 3 weeks ago, but he didn't acknowledge the survivors afterward. Just moved on. Objective focused, Wick said. Seems like. He studied the map. The black marks were concentrated in a rough arc to the northeast. A zone of elevated demon activity centered on what the map labeled as Soldier Field, Ritual Site. With 3 question marks. The green safe routes all bent away from it. What's at Soldier Field? He asked. Carla and Reyes exchanged a look. Moss, from the corner where he was checking his bandage, spoke without looking up. Something's being built there. Or summoned. UAC broadcasts mentioned it once, then stopped mentioning it. Big energy readings, ground shakes near there, even when nothing visible is moving. He flexed his remaining fingers carefully. The demons aren't just patrolling that zone. They're guarding it. John Wick looked at the map for a long time. The ritual site sat at the center of the black marks like a hub. Remove the hub, and the patrol patterns collapsed. Basic tactical geometry, applied to a situation that would have been impossible to explain to him 2 years ago. I need ammunition, he said. 9mm preferably, 45 if not. Token, I need to understand demon physiology, specifically cranial structure and what's behind it. Moss almost smiled. You're going to need bigger guns, friend. Show me what you have. Carla looked at him the way the woman at the Continental's front desk used to look at certain guests, with the recognition that something had just walked through the door that was going to change the nature of the establishment. Not entirely comfortable with it. Not willing to turn it away. Reyes, she said quietly. Show him the cache. The cache was in the parking garage 2 buildings over, accessible through a 3rd-floor sky bridge that Moss had partially collapsed behind them to discourage demon transit. Reyes led him through it with the shotgun up and her footsteps careful, the particular quiet of someone who'd learned silence as survival rather than training. The cache itself was modest by any pre-invasion standard and extraordinary by current ones. 3 shelving units salvaged from a sporting goods store, loaded with scavenged weapons and ammunition sorted by caliber into labeled containers. 2 AR platform rifles with perhaps 200 rounds combined. A 12-gauge pump with 4 boxes of shells. A .357 revolver with 1 speed loader. Various bladed tools elevated to weapon status by necessity, a fire axe, 2 machetes, and a hunting knife still in its retail packaging, and in the corner, wrapped in a moving blanket, something heavier. Reyes pulled the blanket back. UAC military drop. Came down 3 weeks ago, mostly medical supplies, but this was in the crate. She paused. None of us knew how to use it. It was a UAC-modified combat shotgun, not quite like anything John Wick had handled before, but recognizably a shotgun in its operating principles. Heavier than civilian models, with a rectangular energy cell slotted beneath the barrel alongside the traditional tube magazine. The cell glowed faintly orange. Argent-assisted propulsion, though he didn't have that vocabulary yet. He picked it up, ran his hands along it, worked the action. The mechanics were intuitive enough. The energy component was not. What does the orange cell do? He asked. Makes the shots hit harder, Reyes said. A lot harder. We watched it on the broadcast. UAC soldiers using them against cacodemon clusters. She paused. The soldiers are mostly dead now. The guns are better. He checked the tube magazine. Loaded. He checked the energy cell. Indicator light showed roughly 70% capacity. He set it aside and began working through the AR ammunition methodically, loading both rifles to capacity, filling his jacket pockets with the remaining loose rounds. Tell me about the Baron, he said while he worked. The ones you've seen. Reyes leaned against the shelving unit. Big, 8-9 feet, built like... Imagine something that was designed specifically to be impossible to stop. Red. Horns. They throw plasma, green-white, moves fast. And 2 hits from one of those and a concrete wall is rubble. She watched him load. The Slayer killed one with his hands. At the end, after he'd already shot it about 30 times. Weak points. Head like everything else, but the skull is... The bone is like layered ceramic. Standard rifle rounds don't penetrate reliably. You need volume, or you need to get the angle right. She paused. Or you need the UAC weapons. John Wick picked up the modified shotgun again. In his world, his former world, the world with rules he understood, there had been a principle that governed every professional engagement. Know your instrument, know your target, know the gap between them, and close it. The instrument here was unfamiliar. The target was genuinely new. The gap was significant. He began closing it the only way he knew how, so which was methodically and without sentiment. They moved back to the law firm before the light changed. He spent the rest of that day and the following morning learning. He asked Reyes and Carla and Moss questions with the focused patience of a man who had always understood that preparation was just violence organized in advance. Demon movement patterns, feeding behavior, how they responded to sound versus smell versus visual stimulus. Whether they communicated, they did in frequencies partially below human hearing. Whether they pursued or ambushed, both depending on type, with imps preferring pursuit and the heavier classes preferring to establish and hold territory. On the second morning, he went out alone, so he chose a demon patrol, 4 imps moving a circuit through the block to the south, and followed them for 40 minutes before engaging. He needed to understand movement, reaction time, the gap between visual acquisition and physical response. He needed data that only contact could provide. He took the first one from behind with the fire axe he'd borrowed from the cache, driving the blade into the base of the skull where the neck met the cranium. It dropped without a sound. The second turned at the noise of the first falling and took 3 rounds from the Glock before going down. Better angle, better result than his first encounter. The third and fourth charged simultaneously, and he put himself behind a car, made them funnel, took them individually as they came around the front bumper. 5 rounds total for both, to 9 rounds for 4 targets. He was improving the ratio. Then he heard the sound from the alley. It was different from imp noise. Lower, with a resonant quality that he felt in his sternum before he processed it as sound. He moved to the alley entrance and looked. The Baron of Hell occupied most of the alley's width. It was regarding him with the particular attention of something that had assessed and dismissed most threats it had ever encountered, and was now encountering something that registered as marginally more interesting than usual. The plasma formed between its hands slowly. Not urgency. More like a man cracking his knuckles before beginning work he considered routine. John Wick shot it in the face 6 times with the Glock. The Baron shook its head once, the way a person shook off a light slap, and threw the plasma, as he was already moving. Not away, but laterally, using the car he'd been behind as a vector point, rolling across the hood as the plasma hit the wall behind where he'd been standing, and took a 3-foot chunk of brick out of it. He came up with a UAC shotgun, activated it on instinct, and fired twice at close range into the Baron's left eye socket. The energy cell's contribution was immediate and visible. The shots didn't just hit, they penetrated, the Argent-assisted charge driving through the orbital bone and into whatever sat behind it. The Baron staggered. Genuinely staggered, one knee dropping to the alley floor, its plasma extinguishing. John Wick shot it 4 more times in the same location. It went down. He stood over it for 2 seconds, confirming stillness, and noted 2 things. The energy cell was now at 40%, which meant his hands were steady. He'd always had steady hands. It was one of the things that had made him exceptional in his former life, and it appeared to be transferable. He walked back to the law firm. Reyes met him at the stairwell door, took one look at the scorching on his jacket and the Baron Ichor on the shotgun barrel, and said nothing for a moment. "How many rounds?" she finally asked. 15 Glock, 6 shotgun cells. She did the math. For a Baron. "I need to improve the ratio," he said, and walked past her up the stairs. Behind him, Reyes stood in the stairwell for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something that wasn't quite hope, because hope had become an expensive commodity, but was in the same neighborhood. The Baba Yaga, whoever he was, wherever he'd come from, had just killed a Baron of Hell with a pistol and a borrowed shotgun, and was already thinking about how to do it more efficiently next time. She followed him upstairs. The UAC drone found him on the 4th day. He was on the roof of the law firm building running a maintenance check on the AR rifles. Disassembly, cleaning with salvaged solvent, reassembly, function check. When the drone appeared from the northeast, moving low and fast between the buildings with the particular precision of something remotely piloted by someone who knew what they were doing. It was roughly the size of a large bird, matte gray, with the UAC logo on its underbelly and a camera array that rotated to track him the moment it crested the roofline. John Wick looked at it. The drone hovered. He went back to reassembling the rifle. The drone stayed. After approximately 90 seconds, a speaker on its undercarriage crackled to life and a voice emerged. Measured, unhurried, and with the cadence of someone accustomed to being the most informed person in any conversation. "You killed a Baron of Hell with 15 rounds of 9mm and 6 Argent shotgun cells," the voice said. The previous recorded minimum for a Baron kill using conventional weapons was 47 rounds of UAC military-grade ammunition. I find the discrepancy interesting. John Wick set the reassembled rifle down and looked at the drone again. "Who are you?" "Samuel Hayden, Director of the Union Aerospace Corporation. What remains of it?" A pause. "I'm aware that title carries less institutional weight than it once did, given that the institution in question is largely responsible for the current state of the planet. And I find it more useful to focus on present function rather than historical culpability. What do you want? To understand what you are. Our sensors tracked your teleporter signature when you arrived. The relay you came through was a UAC emergency unit, which means you're now in our logs whether either of us prefers it. Another pause. You're not military. Your movement patterns suggest extensive close-quarters combat training, but not any branch doctrine I recognize. Your weapon selection is conventional, your technique is not, and you killed a Baron with equipment that our soldiers, trained soldiers, were dying to. The drone's camera rotated slightly. So, what are you? John Wick considered the question. In his previous life, and this was the kind of conversation that happened in specific rooms with specific protocols, who was asking what they wanted to know, what the cost of the information was, whether the exchange served his interests. Those protocols were built for a world with a functioning underworld economy. He wasn't certain how much of that framework applied here. But information asymmetry was information asymmetry regardless of universe. A professional, he said. Of what kind? The kind that's still alive. A sound from the drone speaker that might have been a dry acknowledgement. I have a proposal. There's a UAC data repository in the Chicago Loop, a hardened server room in what was the UAC Regional Administration building on Wacker Drive. The building is currently occupied by a significant demon concentration. The data it contains includes Argent energy mapping of the ritual site your survivor group has been observing at Soldier Field. A brief pause. That data would tell us what's being built there, how far along the construction is, and whether it can still be stopped. John Wick looked at the map through the rooftop access door, where it was visible on the glass wall below. The black marks, the 3 question marks. Why me? He asked. You have the Slayer. The Doom Slayer is not a precision instrument, Hayden said. He's extraordinarily effective at demon elimination, but subtlety is not his methodology. The repository requires someone who can navigate a building without reducing it to structural components. The server room requires a specific access sequence, and the demon concentration inside is substantial but not. A pause that carried the particular weight of someone choosing words carefully. Not the kind of threat that requires his particular approach. You want someone who can be quiet. I want someone who can be selective. John Wick looked out over the gutted Chicago skyline, the orange-brown ceiling pressing down on everything, the distant sound from the northeast that had been growing steadily louder over the past 2 days. A rhythmic, subsonic pulse that Moss said he could feel in the fillings of his remaining teeth. The ritual site, Wick said. What's being summoned there? A longer pause this time. The drone's camera held steady on his face. Something that, if completed, will render the current state of the planet, which I acknowledge is already catastrophic, significantly worse. Hayden's voice remained level in the way that required effort to maintain. The icon of sin, a demon of sufficient scale and power to qualify as a world-ending event in the literal rather than rhetorical sense. The pulse from the northeast, the black marks on the map, the 3 question marks. The data retrieval, Wick said. What's the demon composition inside the building? Primarily possessed, former UAC personnel. Some imps, 1 confirmed revenant on the upper floors. A pause. You're familiar with revenants? No. Armored skeletal demon. Rocket propulsion. Fast, aggressive, capable of flight in short bursts. And the Argent integration in their skeletal structure makes them resistant to conventional rounds in the thoracic region. Head and propulsion units are vulnerable. Another pause. I'm providing you this information because it increases the probability of mission success, not out of generosity. I want to be transparent about my motivations. John Wick almost appreciated that. In his experience, People who were transparent about their self-interest were significantly less dangerous than people who pretended otherwise. "I'll need better ammunition," he said. "UAC military grade, not the Argent shotgun cell. I need something in a rifle caliber that will handle the possessed efficiently without burning through the cell reserves. I can have a supply drop on your rooftop within the hour. And when I retrieve the data, you bring it to the IRC complex. I'll arrange transport." A brief pause. "You'll also find, once you're inside the building, that our assessment of the situation at Soldier Field has been conservative. The data will clarify what conservative means in this context. The drone's camera made a small adjustment. I suspect you'll want to see it regardless of whether we have a formal arrangement. Because it affects the survivors here. Because it affects everyone still breathing on this continent," Hayden said, "which is a diminishing category." The drone held position for another 3 seconds, then banked and moved northeast, dropping back between the buildings and disappearing. John Wick stood on the rooftop in the sulfur-tinged wind and looked toward Soldier Field, or where it would be, past the gutted buildings and the demon patrol routes and the black marks on Carla's map. The supply drop arrived in 47 minutes. UAC military rifle ammunition, 2 additional Argent energy cells, a compact medical kit, and a folded piece of paper with an access code sequence in Hayden's precise, unhurried handwriting. At the bottom of the note, a single additional line. "The Slayer operates alone by choice. You don't have to." John Wick folded the note, put it in his jacket pocket, and went downstairs to tell Reyes he'd be gone by nightfall. The UAC Regional Administration building on Wacker Drive had been a glass and steel tower once, the kind of corporate architecture that communicated authority through height and reflective surfaces. The glass was gone now, same as everywhere else, but the steel frame held in the lower floors had been reinforced by demon occupation in the particular way demons reinforced things, which meant organic matter threaded through structural gaps, bioluminescent fungal growth along load-bearing walls, and the ambient temperature elevated 15 degrees above the outside air by the collective body heat of whatever lived inside. John Wick observed it for 40 minutes from a parking structure across the street before moving. Then he'd spent his career understanding that buildings were not neutral. They had personalities expressed through their layouts, their choke points, their sight lines, their acoustics. A building told you how it wanted to be moved through if you listened carefully enough. This one was telling him something complicated. The demon concentration Hayden had described as substantial was visible even from across the street. Movement in the lower windows, the orange glow of imp fire in the lobby visible through the empty window frames. The slow patrol of 2 possessed soldiers on the building's exterior perimeter, moving with the shambling wrongness that distinguished them from living humans at any distance. He catalogued 2 exterior, possessed on rotating patrol, gap between their circuits approximately 4 minutes. Lobby held at minimum 6 imps based on visible heat signatures. Upper floors dark but inhabited. The Revenant somewhere above the 8th floor based on the occasional rocket propulsion sound that echoed down the building's exterior. The server room, per Hayden's briefing, was on the 4th floor in the building's core, accessible through the stairwell from the lobby or through a maintenance corridor from the parking structure via a sky bridge on the 3rd floor. He took the sky bridge. The maintenance corridor smelled like copper pipe and demon biology in roughly equal measure. He moved through it with the UAC shotgun slung and the Glock out. Tighter spaces favored the pistol. Then he'd learned in the past 4 days that his accuracy was sufficient to manage possessed at close range with 2 rounds per target if he was disciplined about placement. The corridor was empty. The sky bridge connection to the administration building's 3rd floor showed a single possessed standing at the far end with its back to him, looking out through a demolished section of exterior wall at the street below. John Wick crossed the sky bridge in 11 seconds and killed the possessed with a single round at the base of the skull before it completed its turn. He caught the body and lowered it to the floor without letting it hit. The sound of the shot in the enclosed space was unavoidable. Suppressed carry wasn't a realistic option in this world. Ammunition was too scarce to dedicate to subsonic loads. But the building's ambient noise, and the organic sounds of demon occupation, absorbed it. He held position for 30 seconds. Nothing responded. Stairwell to the 4th floor. The door was ajar, propped open by what appeared to be a chunk of possessed armor. He moved through into a corridor that had once housed offices and now housed 3 imps arranged in a loose cluster near the corridor's midpoint, their attention directed towards something at the far end, a sound, subsonic and rhythmic, emanating from behind a closed door marked with UAC security signage. The server room, 3 imps between him and it. In his former life, 3 armed men in a corridor was a problem with a specific solution set. Spacing, angles, whether they were professionals or not, what they were carrying, which one moved first. The variables were human and therefore bounded. Imps were not human, sir, but they were bounded in their own way. He'd spent 4 days learning those bounds. He took the leftmost one from behind as he'd done with his first imp kill. Axe blade into the cranial junction, no sound. The middle one began turning at the peripheral motion and took 2 rounds in the face before it completed the rotation. The rightmost one charged, and he sidestepped it, let its momentum carry it past, put 2 more rounds into the back of its skull as it went by. 7 rounds total. He was getting the ratio down. The server room door required the access code Hayden had provided, a 12-digit sequence entered on a keypad that miraculously still had power, fed by a UAC emergency battery system that had been designed to outlast most catastrophes. The door opened with a pressurized hiss. Inside, the servers were still running, and the room was cold relative to the rest of the building, climate control on its own isolated circuit, and filled with the soft blue light of active server arrays and the quiet mechanical sound of cooling fans. John Wick found the data port Hayden had specified, inserted the retrieval drive from his jacket pocket, and watched the transfer indicator begin its progress. 60% transfer. 70. He read the accessible data on the terminal screen while he waited. The ritual at Soldier Field had begun 11 days ago. The Argent energy concentration in the area was according to UAC sensor readings, equivalent to a mid-tier hell portal but inverted. Not pulling from hell into Earth, but pushing something specific through from the hell dimension into a prepared vessel. The vessel was physical, architectural, a structure being built at the center of the stadium from materials that the UAC sensors identified as Argent-saturated bone composite. The projected completion timeline, based on construction rate analysis, was 9 days from the data's timestamp. The data was 6 days old. John Wick did the arithmetic. 3 days remaining. He pulled the drive at the completion indicator and stood in the cold blue server room light for a moment, looking at the terminal. The icon of sin. He'd heard the words from Hayden without full context. The data provided context. The UAC files described previous icon manifestations, partial ones, failed summonings, historical accounts compiled from Sentinel records and Hell Dimension reconnaissance. The language in the files was scientific and precise, and the thing it described was neither. Like a demon of sufficient mass to register as a geological event, a reality-warping presence that altered the physics of its immediate environment, a thing that had been stopped once before, according to the Sentinel records, at extraordinary cost. 3 days. He was moving toward the door when he heard the revenant. It came through the ceiling, not the door, the ceiling, dropping through a section of compromised flooring from the 5th floor above with the shriek of tearing metal and the ignition of its rocket propulsion units. It was roughly human-shaped in the way that a rough sketch of a human was human-shaped. Skeletal structure augmented with Argent integrated armor plating, empty orbital sockets burning orange, the rocket units mounted on its shoulders already cycling for a second burst. Hayden had said head and propulsion units. Then John Wick put 2 rounds into the left propulsion unit as the Revenant gained its footing. The unit detonated, not catastrophically, but enough to spin the Revenant sideways and disrupt its targeting. He moved while it was spinning, closed the distance rather than retreating, got inside the reach of its rocket trajectory, and drove the Glock's muzzle into the base of its skull at contact range. 3 rounds. The orange light in its sockets went out. He stepped over it and moved back toward the maintenance corridor. Behind him, the disturbed flooring above the server room settled with a groan, and somewhere on the upper floors, something large shifted its weight in response to the noise. He was across the sky bridge and back in the parking structure before it finished moving. In the cold afternoon air outside, with the subsonic pulse from Soldier Field pressing against his sternum like a second heartbeat, John Wick understood for the first time, with complete clarity, what the rules of this world actually were. There were no rules. There was only what you could stop and what you couldn't. He started moving toward the ARC complex. The ARC complex sat 20 miles outside the city in what had been a UAC logistics hub, a sprawling installation of reinforced concrete and blast shielding that had been designed to withstand industrial accidents and had been repurposed with grim efficiency to withstand the end of the world. The perimeter was layered. Outer ring of automated sentry systems, middle ring of manned fortifications, staffed by UAC security personnel and civilian militia. Inner ring of actual military-grade barrier structures that could withstand Baron-class plasma impact for approximately 4 minutes before requiring replacement. John Wick reached the outer perimeter checkpoint at dusk, presented the UAC retrieval drive to the checkpoint officer as identification of purpose, and was escorted inside before full dark. The interior of the ARC complex was the most functional thing he'd seen since Montana. Not comfortable. Comfort was a category that had been suspended indefinitely, but functional in the way that suggested people with competence and resources were working problems rather than simply surviving them. UAC engineers moved between structures with purpose. Medical personnel managed a triage facility that operated with a kind of exhausted professionalism. The smell was diesel fuel, antiseptic, and the particular human odor of people under sustained stress, which was familiar enough to be almost grounding. Hayden met him in the operations center. He was not what John Wick had expected, which was itself informative. The cybernetic body was immediately apparent. The proportions slightly wrong for a human skeleton, like the movements carrying the precise economy of actuated rather than biological musculature, the eyes behind the transparent faceplate holding the particular stillness of someone for whom blinking was a choice rather than a reflex. He was tall. He dominated the operations center not through aggression, but through the gravity of absolute certainty. The room organized itself around him the way rooms organized themselves around people who had decided they were the most important person in them and had, through sustained effort, made it true. "The drive," Hayden said by way of greeting. Wick handed it over. Hayden passed it to a technician without looking away from Wick. "The Revenant on the 5th floor," Hayden said. "Our sensors track the engagement. There's contact range kill." It was the most efficient solution available. It was also potentially suicidal. "Revenants at contact range are dead," Wick said. "At contact range, they're dead." A pause. Hayden's expression, to the degree that his cybernetic face expressed things, carried the quality of reassessment. "Sit down," he said. "We need to discuss Soldier Field." The operations center's main display showed a live sensor feed of the ritual site, thermal imaging overlaid with argent energy mapping, the stadium rendered in false color with the bone composite structure at its center glowing white-hot in the argent spectrum. The construction was further along than the 6-day-old data had suggested. The walls of the vessel structure were complete, and what remained was the interior work, the specific geometric arrangement of argent conduits that would channel the summoning energy. 2 days, Hayden said. "Not 3. The construction rate accelerated 40 hours ago. We believe a Hell Priest arrived to oversee the final phase. Which one? Hayden looked at him with a slight recalibration of someone noting an unexpected question. You know about the Hell Priests. I read your files while the drive was transferring. Deg Rannoch, Hayden said, the second of the three. He specializes in Argent energy architecture, the structural arrangement of conduits for maximum summoning efficiency. His presence means the final construction will be precise rather than approximate. A pause. Approximate summonings fail, precise ones don't. Wick studied the display. So the sensor feed showed demon concentrations around the stadium in density patterns he'd learned to read over the past 5 days. The heaviest clusters at the cardinal approach points, lighter coverage on the elevated structures, the interior of the stadium itself essentially a continuous demon presence surrounding the construction site. How many personnel do you have capable of operating inside that concentration? He asked. Effective ones. Hayden's voice carried something that wasn't quite bitterness, more like the specific fatigue of a man who had made catastrophic decisions and was living in their consequences. The Doomslayer, possibly you, based on current evidence. A pause. Our military personnel are effective in defensive positions and structured engagements. At the interior of that stadium is neither. What about a combined approach? Exterior pressure from your military units to fix the demon concentration at the perimeter, while interior personnel move on the construction site. We've modeled it. The demon concentration at the perimeter is sufficient to destroy our exterior units before interior personnel could complete the mission. We'd lose the military capacity we need to maintain this facility's defense. Hayden's eyes held steady on the display. The math is unfavorable. The math changes if the interior personnel are fast enough. Fast enough to destroy a Argent energy architecture installation, eliminate a Hell Priest, and exit before the perimeter. Concentration collapses inward. A pause. That's a very specific kind of fast. John Wick looked at the display for a long moment, though the white-hot construction at the stadium's center, the demon density patterns, the 2 entry points that the sensor feed showed as marginally less saturated than the others. Not clear, but thinner. He traced the route in his mind, the way he used to trace routes through buildings before a contract, identifying the choke points, the decision points, the places where commitment became irreversible. I want to see the Slayer, he said. Hayden was quiet for a moment. He doesn't take meetings. I'm not requesting a meeting. Another pause. He's currently in the facility's eastern armory. He resupplies here occasionally. He doesn't communicate with personnel, but he tolerates the facility's presence. The cybernetic eyes moved to Wick's face. I should tell you, most people find direct proximity to him uncomfortable. Like he carries a quality that's difficult to articulate. I've been in rooms with dangerous people my entire life, Wick said. Not like this one, Hayden said. He found the Eastern Armory without an escort, which he suspected was a mild test that he declined to treat as one. The armory was a large space, high-ceilinged, smelling of weapon oil and the particular metallic tang of Argent-charged ammunition. It was empty except for one figure at the far end, standing at a workbench with his back to the door. The Doomslayer was larger than the descriptions had suggested. Not in a way that registered as human large, more the way a geological feature was large, a thing whose scale you understood intellectually before your instincts processed it. The Praetor suit was green and gray and showed the accumulated damage of a campaign that had been running longer than John Wick had been alive, repaired and redamaged, and repaired again until the repair marks were their own kind of record. He was performing maintenance on a weapon John Wick didn't recognize, moving with the absolute economy of someone for whom every motion had been reduced to its essential component through repetition measured in decades. He didn't turn when Wick entered. John Wick walked to the workbench and stood 6 feet to the Slayer's left. He didn't speak. He looked at the weapon the Slayer was working on and waited. For 90 seconds, neither of them moved. Then the Slayer set the weapon down and turned his head, just slightly. Not enough to make eye contact directly. More the peripheral acknowledgement of something that had passed an initial assessment. The helmet's visor reflected John Wick's own image back at him, distorted slightly by the curve of the faceplate. The Slayer picked the weapon back up and resumed his maintenance. John Wick stood there for another 30 seconds, then walked back to the operations center. He'd learned what he needed to learn, which was this. The Slayer's stillness in the armory was the same quality as his own stillness in rooms before violence. Not absence of intent, but its perfect conservation. Every unit of it saved for the moment it was needed. They were, in the only way that mattered in this world, the same kind of thing. He found Hayden in the operations center and said, "Show me the entry points again." They gave him a room in the facility's personnel block. A bunk, a footlocker, 8 hours before Hayden needed an answer on the soldier field operation. He used 4 of those hours for sleep, which was a professional habit rather than a comfort. The body required maintenance the same as any instrument, and a poorly maintained instrument failed at the worst possible moments. The other 4 hours he spent thinking about Argent Energy. He'd been thinking about it since the server room, since reading the UAC files in the cold blue terminal light. The files described Argent Energy in technical language that became, at its edges, something closer to confession. The language of scientists who had discovered something that worked extraordinarily well and had chosen not to look carefully at the mechanism of its working until looking away was no longer possible. Argent Energy was refined human souls. The process of refinement was not metaphorical. The UAC had built an economy on the organized suffering of human beings processed through Hell's infrastructure, and they had done it knowingly at the highest levels because the alternative was watching the rest of humanity die in the dark. John Wick had spent his career operating in moral frameworks that most people preferred not to examine closely. He understood the architecture of necessary compromise. The things you did because the alternative was worse. The lines you drew and the lines you didn't. And the cost of the work and who paid it. He was not a man who flinched from difficult arithmetic. But there was a difference between difficult arithmetic and what the UAC files described. And the ammunition in his jacket. The UAC military-grade rounds Hayden had dropped on the law firm rooftop. The Argent Energy cells in the modified shotgun carried a weight now that it hadn't carried before he'd read those files. He used it anyway, because 3 days, 2 days now, and the icon of sin, and 43 people in Montana, and 11 people in a Chicago law firm, and however many people were still breathing on this continent. The arithmetic was still arithmetic, but he noted the weight. He didn't put it down. At hour 5, a knock at the door. He was already sitting up. The woman who entered was a UAC engineer, mid-30s, carrying a tablet and the particular expression of someone who had been assigned a task they found both urgent and awkward. Her name badge said Dr. Chen, E. She set the tablet on the footlocker without preamble and turned it to face him. "Director Hayden asked me to brief you on the Argent exposure protocols," she said, "given that you've been operating with Argent-enhanced munitions for 5 days without a baseline screening." "What's the protocol?" "There isn't one, technically. The research division was working on one when..." She gestured at the general concept of the world outside. "What we know is that sustained Argent exposure without the Praetor suit's filtration system produces measurable neurological effects in human subjects. Elevated aggression, reduced inhibition around violence, heightened pain tolerance." A pause. In short-term exposure, these effects are largely indistinguishable from adrenaline response. In long-term exposure, they become structural. John Wick looked at the tablet. The neurological mapping it showed meant little to him specifically, but the trend lines were legible enough. A progressive curve moving in one direction. "How long is long-term?" he asked. "We don't have good data. The Doomslayer has been exposed for... we don't know how long, honestly. Decades at minimum," His neurological baseline is so far outside normal human parameters that he's not useful as a comparison point. Dr. Chen's voice remained clinical in the way that required concentration to maintain. For an unaugmented human subject operating with Argent-assisted weapons at your usage rate, so we estimate meaningful neurological drift beginning around the 2-week mark. I've been here 5 days. Yes. A pause. We're not detecting anything significant yet, but the effects are cumulative and they accelerate with intensity of exposure. A high Argent environment, like the interior of a demon-occupied stadium during an active summoning ritual, would compress that timeline considerably. John Wick sat with this for a moment. In his former world, the corruption vectors had been different. Money, loyalty, fear, love, the particular vulnerability of men who had something left to lose. He'd watched people compromised by all of those. He'd been compromised by one of them himself. Once, in a way that had cost him everything and eventually given him something worse than nothing, which was purpose without peace. And Argent corruption was the same architecture, different material. "What are the early indicators?" he asked. Dr. Chen looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating their assessment of a person. "You're asking so you can monitor yourself." "Yes. Intrusive violent ideation that feels like clarity rather than impulse. Anger that feels proportionate when it isn't. The sense that mercy is a computational error." She paused. "Essentially, the feeling that the Doomslayer's approach to every situation is not just effective, but correct. Philosophically correct. The only logical response to any threat." John Wick thought about the Revenant. Contact range, 3 rounds. The efficiency of it, the clean simplicity of the solution. He thought about how it had felt, not just effective, but right in a way that his work had rarely felt right. A way that his former work had occasionally felt right in moments he'd always subsequently examined carefully. He noted this, filed it. "Thank you," he said. "I'll monitor." Dr. Chen left. John Wick sat on the bunk for another hour, running Soldier Field in his mind, the entry points, the demon density, the construction site at the center, Deg Rannoch somewhere in the interior, overseeing the final phase of a ritual that would end 3 days from now in something too large to fight and too important to allow. At hour 8, he went back to the operations center. Hayden was at the main display, which now showed updated sensor data. The Argent concentration at the ritual site had intensified overnight. The white-hot signature at the center of the stadium spreading outward through the conduit network like roots through soil. Around the perimeter, the demon concentration had thickened. New elements had appeared in the sensor data, larger thermal signatures, moving with the slow, deliberate weight of Baron-class entities. "They know we have the data," Wick said. "They know someone entered the administration building and retrieved something," Hayden confirmed. "Hell's intelligence network is not what we'd call sophisticated, but it's functional. Deg Rannoch will have been informed that UAC assets are aware of the construction timeline." A pause. "He's accelerating." "How much time?" 36 hours, perhaps less." Hayden turned from the display. "I need your answer." John Wick looked at the sensor feed, the white-hot center of it, and the demon density between him and it. The 2 thin entry points he'd identified the previous night, now slightly thicker as the concentration reinforced. In the armory down the corridor, he could hear, faintly, at the edge of perception, the sound of a chainsaw being tested. A brief rev, then silence. "I'll go in," Wick said, "but I want the Argent filtration unit from Dr. Chen's inventory. Whatever portable version exists." He paused. "And I want to know what happens to Deg Rannoch's concentration once he's dead, whether it disperses or transfers." Hayden was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone deciding how much to tell. "It disperses," he said finally. "The Hell Priest is the organizational principle of the local demon hierarchy. Remove him and the concentration loses coordination. They don't stop, but they stop being directed. That's the difference I need, Wick said. He went back to the armory to resupply. The Doom Slayer was gone, but the workbench showed the clean, organized evidence of someone who had passed through and left nothing wasted. John Wick stood at the adjacent bench and began loading magazines with the systematic focus of a man preparing for work. He understood completely, in a world he understood only partially, against an enemy he was still learning. The weight of the Argent rounds was still there. He loaded them anyway. The arithmetic was still arithmetic. He went in at 0300. The logic was sound. Demon visual processing was calibrated for the permanent orange-brown twilight of hell-invaded Earth, and the deeper dark of pre-dawn represented a marginal advantage worth taking. Marginal advantages were the only kind available, and John Wick had built his entire career on the compound interest of marginal advantages, applied with absolute consistency. The portable Argent filtration unit Dr. Chen had provided was a disc-shaped device worn against the sternum, held in place by a harness that sat under his jacket. It hummed faintly against his ribs. Not uncomfortably, more like a second heartbeat running slightly out of phase with his own. Doctor Chen had calibrated it to his baseline readings and told him it would reduce Argent absorption by approximately 60% in a high-exposure environment. Not elimination, reduction. He'd taken that and said nothing about the remaining 40%. The southern entry point was a service tunnel. Maintenance access running beneath the stadium's south stands, originally used for equipment and now used by nothing, because the demon concentration had organized itself around the stadium's surface level and hadn't bothered with the infrastructure below it. Hayden's sensor data showed the tunnel as clear of thermal signatures. Whether Hayden's sensor data was entirely reliable was a variable John Wick had factored into his planning by assuming it was approximately 80% accurate and treating the remainder as unknown. And he moved through the tunnel with a flashlight taped to the UAC shotgun's barrel. Red lens, minimal signature, and the Glock in his right hand. The tunnel smelled like old concrete and standing water, and underneath both of those the pervasive organic wrongness that demon occupation left in enclosed spaces, like the biology of hell, was slowly colonizing the infrastructure of everything it touched. He heard the marauder before he saw it. The sound was wrong. Not demon wrong, something more specific than that. A metallic rhythmic quality, like armor moving, but with an underlying organic resonance. He stopped moving and processed it. Hayden had briefed him on marauders in the operations center, corrupted night sentinels, Hell's re-engineering of the warriors who had once opposed it. Fast, aggressive, she carrying a spectral battle axe and a shield that blocked energy-based attacks. Vulnerable in the brief window after their own attack cycle completed. It came around a curve in the tunnel 40 feet ahead, moving with a speed that was wrong for something wearing that much armor. Not running exactly. More like the armor and the thing inside it had reached an agreement about momentum that didn't require the usual biological negotiations. John Wick pressed himself into a maintenance alcove and let it pass. It passed within 4 feet of him. He could feel the heat coming off it. Argent integration ran hot, Dr. Chen had said, the energy metabolizing continuously through the augmented skeletal structure. The smell was iron and sulfur and something burnt. It moved past without slowing, its attention directed forward along the tunnel, and he waited 10 seconds, then continued. The tunnel opened into a service bay beneath the stadium's field level, a large concrete space that had once housed groundskeeping equipment and now housed nothing except the ambient Argent energy that was, at this proximity to the ritual site, visible to the naked eye. Not the faint orange glow of the shotgun's energy cell, something deeper and more saturated, a luminescence that came from the air itself, as if the space between molecules had been replaced with something that burned without combustion. The filtration unit against his sternum increased its frequency slightly. He felt the change. A subtle dampening of something he hadn't fully registered was affecting him until it was being counteracted. A clarity at the edges of his perception that he recognized, and with the cold analytical part of his mind, as the artificial clarity Dr. Chen had warned him about. The sense that every violent solution was not just effective, but philosophically correct. He noted it, kept moving. The field-level access, a ramp from the service bay up to the stadium's playing surface, was guarded by 2 possessed soldiers and an imp cluster. He took the possessed with the Glock, 2 rounds each, moving between shots to prevent the second one tracking the report of the first. The imps charged at the sound, and he met them at the ramp's base with the shotgun, the Argent cells doing their work at close range with a brutality that was efficient and nothing more than efficient, which was the only way he permitted himself to process it. He came up the ramp and onto the field. So the construction was larger than the sensor data had suggested. The bone composite structure occupied the stadium's entire center, not a building exactly. More like a geometric argument made in physical form, a series of interlocking arches and conduit channels rising 40 feet from the field's surface and radiating outward in patterns that hurt to look at directly, not because they were bright, but because the geometry was wrong in a way that the human visual system registered as threat before the conscious mind finished processing the shape. At its center, a chamber. Open at the top, Argent energy pouring upward from it in a column that disappeared into the orange-brown ceiling far above. Around it, demons, not patrolling, standing, arranged in concentric rings around the structure with a particular stillness of things performing a function that didn't require movement. Ritual guards, organized, directed, and at the structure's base, moving along the conduit channels with the focused attention of someone checking the final calculations on work they intended to be perfect. A figure that was humanoid in outline and wrong in every specific. Diag Ranak. The Hell Priest's physical form was tall and angular, robed in something that moved like fabric and burned like the Argent column above him, his attention entirely on the conduit network at his feet. Around him, the nearest demon ring stood close enough to respond to any threat within seconds. John Wick crouched at the ramp's exit and ran the numbers. The demon rings between him and Ranak numbered in the dozens. The Argent environment at this proximity was saturating. He could feel the filtration unit working at capacity, could feel the 40% it wasn't catching pressing at the edges of his perception with the insistence of a very reasonable argument. The clarity was there, the sense that the direct approach was not just viable, but correct, that the distance between him and Ranak was a problem with a simple solution that only required commitment and sufficient ammunition. He recognized this, named it for what it was, set it aside. The direct approach would get him killed inside 30 seconds. The demon rings were too dense, the response time too fast. He needed Ranak isolated, or he needed the rings disrupted, and he had neither the personnel for a diversion, nor the chainsaw sound came from the stadium's north end, and John Wick looked up. The Doomslayer came over the north stands at a dead run, not descending carefully, not assessing, just moving with the absolute commitment of something that had decided direction and velocity and intended to honor both regardless of what occupied the intervening space. He hit the field level and was already firing, the BFG's green plasma charge lighting the entire stadium in a single catastrophic pulse that killed the outer 2 demon rings simultaneously and sent the surviving inner rings into the reactive chaos of things whose organizational principle had just been violently disrupted. Not directed, not planned. The Slayer operated alone and on his own timeline, but the result was the same. John Wick was moving before the BFG's light faded, using the disruption, moving through the gap in the inner rings with the Glock out and his route calculated to bring him to Ranak's position along the conduit channels where the bone composite structure provided intermittent cover. Around him, the surviving demons were orienting toward the north end, toward the Slayer, toward the thing that represented the greater immediate threat, and giving him the marginal advantage he needed. He was 60 feet from Ranak when the Hell Priest looked up from his conduit work and found him with eyes that burned the same color as the Argent column above. Ranak raised one hand, and the air between them became something solid and wrong. The blast hit John Wick in the chest and lifted him off the field surface entirely. He hit the bone composite structure's outer arch 15 feet away and felt something crack in his left side. Ribs, 2 at minimum, the familiar, specific pain of it distinguishable from other damage, and came down on the field surface in a controlled fall that was less controlled than he preferred. The filtration unit's housing had cracked on impact. He could feel the difference immediately. The 40% became 60, became more, the clarity flooding in with the sudden warmth of something that felt like focus and wasn't. He stood up anyway. Dig Ranak watched him stand with the expression of something that had expected him to stay down, processing the failure of that expectation with the slow recalibration of genuine surprise. John Wick raised the Glock and put 2 rounds into Ranak's left shoulder, adjusting his aim for the biological architecture Dr. Chen had briefed him on. Hell Priests were not demons in the standard sense, their physiology distinct, their vulnerabilities specific. The shoulder shots were not intended to kill. They were intended to interrupt, to break the Hell Priest's concentration on whatever he'd been preparing to do next. They worked. Ranak stepped back, his right hand coming up to the wound with the automatic response of something that didn't experience pain often enough to manage it smoothly. His attention fractured between John Wick and the conduit network at his feet. The calculations, the final phase, the 36-hour timeline that had been compressing since Wick retrieved the drive from the administration building. 40 feet away, the Doomslayer's chainsaw rev announced another engagement with the inner demon ring. John Wick moved toward Ranak through the argent light, the cracked ribs burning with each breath, the filtration unit silent against his sternum, and the clarity pressing in from every direction with the absolute insistence of something that had decided it was not corruption but truth. He named it anyway. Set it aside anyway. The arithmetic was still arithmetic. He had work to do. Diag Ranak was not accustomed to being approached. John Wick understood this within the first 15 seconds of closing the distance. The Hell Priest's responses were calibrated for things that maintained range, that respected the argent power he projected as a perimeter, that treated the space around him as fundamentally hostile territory. The concentric demon rings were an expression of this philosophy. The Argent Blasts were an expression of this philosophy. Everything about Ranak's combat architecture assumed that the threat would stay at a distance where his advantages were decisive. John Wick had spent his career making sure he was never where the other person's advantages were decisive. He closed to 30 feet before Ranak recalibrated and launched a second Argent Blast, different from the first, more focused, a concentrated beam rather than an area pulse. Wick dropped below it, felt the heat of it pass over the back of his neck close enough to raise the skin, and kept moving. 20 feet. The bone composite structure's conduit channels were at knee height here, threading through the field surface in geometric patterns that required him to step carefully. A wrong foot placement, and the channel edges would take his ankle. He moved through them without looking down, his eyes on Ranak, trusting the map of the space his peripheral vision had built in the seconds since he'd reached the field level. Ranak retreated toward the central chamber. This was the wrong direction for Ranak, and Wick understood immediately why. The Hell Priest was moving toward the Argent Column, toward the concentration of energy at the ritual site's heart, where his power would be maximized, and where the summoning's final phase could potentially be triggered manually if the conduit network was sufficiently charged. A last resort, an escalation from ritual completion to emergency invocation. Wick pushed his pace despite the ribs. 15 feet. Ranak turned and launched 3 rapid Argent pulses in sequence, not the careful aimed work of his earlier attacks, the faster, less precise output of something operating under pressure. The first Wick sidestepped. The second he took on his right forearm, the impact spinning him half a rotation, but not stopping his forward momentum. The third he ducked under completely and came up inside Ranak's reach. The Hell Priest was tall. The physical leverage was wrong for standard grappling. John Wick adapted in real time, not fighting the leverage differential, but using it, getting his left hand on Ranak's robe at the chest, using the Hell Priest's own backward momentum to direct rather than oppose, driving him sideways away from the central chamber and into the bone composite structure's outer wall. Ranak hit the wall with a sound that was wrong for bone. Too resonant, too deep, like a bell made of something that should not ring. His argent output spiked at contact, a reflexive discharge that hit Wick at point-blank range, and this time the filtration unit was not functioning and there was nothing between him and the full saturation of it. It felt like clarity. It felt like every decision he'd ever made that he'd examined afterward and found wanting had simply been the result of insufficient commitment. And it felt like the gap between what violence was and what it could be, closing to nothing. It felt like the Doomslayer's approach to every room, not a method, not a tactic, but a philosophy. Everything demonic dies. Everything in the way of that objective is either a tool or an obstacle. The arithmetic is simple, and the only error is hesitation. John Wick stood with this for approximately 2 seconds. Then he named it, set it aside. It took more effort than it had in the service bay. The cracked filtration unit against his sternum was silent, and the Argent column was 20 feet away, and the saturation level in the central chamber was, he estimated, somewhere above anything Dr. Chen's data had described as a reference point. And the effort required to set it aside was physical. A resistance in his own cognition that he pushed through the way he pushed through physical pain, not by eliminating it, but by deciding it was not the determining factor. He pressed the Glock against Deg Ranak's skull. "The conduit network," he said. His voice was level. "Can it be reversed?" Ranak looked at him with the burning eyes of something processing an entirely unexpected variable. Hell Priests did not receive questions from things that should be dead. The computational delay was genuine. "Can it be reversed?" Wick said again. "The network is complete," Ranak said. His voice was wrong, layered, resonant at frequencies below speech. "The summoning requires only the final invocation. You cannot stop what has already. That's not what I asked." A pause. The Argent column above them pulsed, and in the pulse, John Wick felt the full weight of the saturation press against his cognition, with the insistence of something that had decided argument was unnecessary when certainty was available. He held his position in his own mind through pure professional discipline. The same stillness he'd held in rooms before violence, the same conservation of intent. "The conduit channels can be disrupted," Ranak said finally. The burning eyes held something that wasn't quite fear, but was in the same register, the particular discomfort of something immortal encountering a mortal who was not behaving according to the established parameters of mortality. "The geometric integrity of the network requires all primary junctions intact. Destroy 3 junction points and the summoning architecture collapses." A pause. "But you cannot reach 3 junction points before the invocation completes. The timeline. Where are the junction points?" Ranak told him. John Wick suspected the Hell Priest told him because the alternative was the gun, and because something in Ranak's ancient calculus had not yet fully processed that the information being given would actually be used. Immortal things sometimes had that blind spot. The assumption that providing the means of their defeat was safely academic because the mortal receiving the information lacked the capacity to act on it in time. Wick released him, turned, and ran. The junction points were marked in the conduit network's geometry. Larger nodes where multiple channels converged, visible as brighter concentrations of argent luminescence at the field surface. The first was 30 feet north of the central chamber. He reached it and drove the fire axe he'd been carrying since the law firm through the node, housing with both hands behind the strike, the Argent energy discharging at the break in a flash that left his forearms numb from the wrist up. The conduit network dimmed slightly, a visible reduction in the column's intensity. Behind him, Ranak screamed. Not pain, something between rage and the specific sound of a calculated timeline collapsing. The second junction was 60 feet east. And he was running, and the ribs were making each breath a negotiation, and the Argent saturation was pressing in from every direction, and behind him, the demon ring that had been oriented toward the Doomslayer was beginning to reorient. Ranak's direction, the disruption in the network registering as the priority threat. He reached the second junction and destroyed it with the axe handle when the blade lodged and wouldn't release. A cruder strike, less clean, but the result was the same. The column above flickered. The bone composite structure's geometry shifted audibly. A groan of stressed material, a sound like something enormous taking a breath before a decision. The third junction was on the far side of the central chamber. The reoriented demon ring was between him and it. John Wick assessed this in the approximately 3 seconds he had before the ring completed its reorientation and committed to engagement. The Glock had 6 rounds remaining. The shotgun had 1 Argent cell at partial capacity. The axe handle was cracked. His left side was one continuous statement of structural complaint, and his forearms were returning sensation in the specific way that suggested the numbness had been protective, and the sensation replacing it was going to be worse. The Doomslayer hit the demon ring from the north side like a geological event. He didn't coordinate. He didn't communicate. He simply moved in the direction that contained the most demons and began the work of reducing that number, the chainsaw and the super shotgun alternating in a rhythm that was brutal and efficient and entirely his own. So the ring dissolved into chaos. Not the disrupted chaos of Ranak's organizational principle failing, the immediate physical chaos of something tearing through a concentration at a speed that didn't allow coordinated response. John Wick moved through the gap. He reached the third junction with 2 imps on his heels and the Glock empty and the shotgun in his right hand. He fired the remaining Argent cell into the node at contact range. The discharge was catastrophic at that proximity, the energy release far beyond the controlled break of the axe strikes. A detonation that lifted him off his feet for the second time in 20 minutes and deposited him 8 feet away on the field's surface, while the 2 pursuing imps ceased to exist as coherent biological entities. The Argent column above the central chamber went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Out. A complete cessation, instantaneous, as if a switch had been thrown on something that had been building toward critical mass for 11 days. The bone composite structure shuddered through its entire 40-foot height, the geometric arches losing their internal coherence, the conduit channels going dark. The Argent luminescence that had saturated the air of the central chamber began to disperse. Slowly at first, then faster, the energy bleeding out of the local environment with the particular finality of something that required very specific conditions to exist and was discovering those conditions had been removed. In the sudden comparative darkness, the stadium's ambient noise changed. The demon ring that had been performing ritual guard function lost its direction, and not immediately. The transition from directed to undirected took 30 seconds. 40. The coordination dissolving gradually as Ranak's organizational principle dispersed with the network he'd built. They didn't stop. They didn't retreat. But they stopped being a coherent tactical entity and became individual threats, which was a fundamentally different problem. John Wick lay on the field's surface and breathed carefully around the ribs and took inventory. Glock empty, shotgun spent, fire axe handle cracked, left side compromised, filtration unit non-functional, Argent saturation in his system at an unknown level that Dr. Chen would need to assess. Both forearms reporting pain that was going to be significantly worse by morning. Alive. He sat up. Across the field, But the Doomslayer was still working through the undirected demon concentration with the absolute commitment of something that had a philosophy about incomplete work. In the shadows near the collapsed conduit network, Dag Ranak was gone. Not dead, not destroyed, but gone. The Hell Priest's physical form having vacated the premises at the moment the network failed with the speed of something that had survived long enough to recognize an unwinnable situation. Alive, escaped, unfinished. John Wick noted this with the professional clarity of a man who understood that incomplete work had a way of scheduling itself for completion on its own timeline. He found a combat knife in a dead UAC soldier's kit at the field's edge and stood up with it in his hand and looked at the undirected demons and the Doomslayer moving through them and the dead Argent column and the dispersing luminescence. The Argent saturation in the air was dropping. He could feel his own cognition returning from the edge of the clarity that wasn't clarity. Slowly, unevenly, the way vision returned after a bright light, the normal parameters of his thinking reasserting themselves against the retreating pressure. He picked up a fallen UAC rifle from the field surface, checked the magazine, and went back to work. The stadium was quiet by 0530. Not silent. The city was never silent anymore, the ambient sounds of demon occupation too deeply threaded into Chicago's infrastructure to stop simply because one ritual site had been disrupted. But the particular quality of sound that had characterized Soldier Field for the past 11 days, the subsonic pulse, the chanting at wrong frequencies, the organizational hum of a directed demon concentration, was gone. What remained was the ordinary chaos of undirected demons in a large space. And undirected demons in a large space were a problem John Wick understood how to manage. He and the Doomslayer managed it without speaking, without coordinating, and without any acknowledgement of shared purpose beyond the functional reality that they were both moving through the same space in the same direction, killing the same things. The Slayer's methodology was total. He moved through demon concentrations the way fire moved through dry timber, consuming completely, leaving nothing viable behind him. John Wick moved differently, selective, economical, conserving ammunition with the discipline of someone who had learned in 5 days what the Slayer had learned over decades, which was that ammunition was the only currency that mattered and waste was a form of debt. They were not the same, but they were, in the only way the current world measured such things, compatible. And the last demon in the stadium, a Baron that had survived the BFG pulse by being on the wrong side of a concrete support column at the right moment, died at 0523. The Slayer killed it with the crucible in a single strike that left the air smelling of ozone and something older than electricity, a smell John Wick associated with the Argent energy, but purer, less corrupted. The smell of something that had been made specifically for this purpose and was functioning exactly as intended. The Slayer stood over the Baron's remains for a moment, not surveying, not resting, but with the quality of something briefly present before the next direction revealed itself. Then he looked across the ruined field at John Wick. John Wick looked back. The Slayer's visor reflected the gray, pre-dawn light coming through the stadium's open roof. The orange-brown ceiling had thinned slightly in the hours since the Argent column went out, as if the ritual's energy had been contributing to the atmospheric corruption and its absence had created a marginal, temporary clearing. Through the thinning, something approximating actual sky was visible. Not blue, not yet, but less wrong than it had been. The Slayer turned and walked north, toward the stadium's exit, toward whatever the next direction was. He didn't look back. He didn't acknowledge what had happened in the stadium beyond the fact of it being done, which was, John Wick understood, the only acknowledgement available from something that measured the world entirely in terms of work completed and work remaining, till he watched the green armor disappear through the north exit. Then he sat down on the field surface, set the UAC rifle across his knees, and breathed carefully around the ribs for a few minutes. The UAC extraction team arrived at 0612. 2 armored vehicles from the ARC complex, moving fast and tactical through the demon-thinned south approaches. Hayden had been monitoring, as Hayden was always monitoring everything. The team's medic found John Wick sitting in the same position he'd sat down in and assessed the damage with brisk efficiency. 2 cracked ribs confirmed, 3rd possible, both forearms showing argent burn patterning consistent with direct node contact. Contusion on the right forearm significant enough to require wrapping. Overall blood loss from minor lacerations categorized as manageable. The medic said nothing about the argent saturation readings the portable scanner produced. The expression on his face said enough. They drove him back to the ARC complex as the sky lightened, marginally, tentatively, the orange-brown ceiling neither breaking nor thickening, holding in a kind of suspension as if the atmosphere itself was waiting to see what happened next. Hayden met him in the medical bay, rather than the operations center, which was itself a form of communication. The cybernetic director stood at the room's edge while the medic completed the rib wrapping and the argent burn treatment, and said nothing until the medic left. Dag Rannoch escaped, Hayden said. Yes. The conduit network is destroyed. The ritual architecture is non-recoverable without rebuilding from foundation. That process takes months at minimum. A pause. You've bought time, not stopped it. No, Hayden said. Not stopped it. He was quiet for a moment with the quality of a man doing arithmetic he'd done many times before and arriving at the same answer. The icon of sin summoning will be attempted again. Different location, different timeline. Rannoch will rebuild. Another pause. But months matter. Every month is resources we accumulate, defensive positions we establish, survivors we reach. He looked at Wick with the cybernetic eyes that held their particular brand of unsentimental assessment. You matter, functionally. I want to be transparent about that as well. John Wick looked at the argent burn patterning on his forearms, the faint, luminescent tracing that doctor. Chen would later tell him might fade over weeks, or might not fade at all depending on exposure depth. A record of the work, written in the work's own material. The 11 survivors in the loop, he said. Carla's group. I want them extracted to the ARC complex. Hayden nodded once. Done. And the 43 in Montana. There's a UAC relay unit in their basement that still functions. Coordinates are in my jacket. Also done. A pause. Is there anything else? John Wick thought about Dag Rannoch, moving through whatever hell dimension transit system the priests used, carrying the knowledge of a failed ritual and the specific memory of a mortal who had approached him and not died. He thought about the icon of sin. Still real, still possible. The summoning delayed rather than prevented. And he thought about the argent saturation in his system that Dr. Chen's assessment would quantify in the morning, and the filtration unit that had cracked at the worst possible moment, and the 2 seconds he'd stood in the central chamber with the clarity that wasn't clarity pressing in from every direction, and named it and set it aside and kept moving. He thought about a dog he'd once had. The reason he'd gotten it. The reason, ultimately, that he was still capable of naming things for what they were and setting them aside. Because someone had understood that the part of him that could make that distinction was worth preserving, and had given him something to preserve it with. The dog was gone. The capacity remained. He intended to keep it. The argent filtration unit, he said. I need a replacement. It's better housing this time. Hayden almost smiled, or performed the cybernetic approximation of it. I'll have Dr. Chen design one rated for direct node contact. John Wick nodded and lay back on the medical bay cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to the Archie complex's sounds. The diesel generators, the distant drills of personnel training in the yard, the medical equipment's quiet beeping, the human sounds of an installation that was still functioning, still accumulating resources, still reaching survivors, still doing the work that the work required. Outside, somewhere above the orange-brown ceiling, the sun existed. It would still be there when the ceiling broke. He intended to be there too. 3 days later, Carla's group arrived at the ARC complex in a UAC transport. Reyes had the shotgun. Moss had a new bandage and was already asking the UAC engineers questions. The two teenagers looked at the fortified installation with the expression of people encountering something they'd stopped believing existed, which was the specific expression of hope reforming after extended absence. Carla found John Wick in the facility's eastern yard, running weapon drills with the methodical repetition of someone maintaining an instrument they intended to use again soon. She stood at the yard's edge and watched him for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The retrieval, soldier field, any of it." John Wick lowered the weapon and looked at her. He thought about how to answer and found that the honest answer was also the simple one. "Yes," he said, "I did." He raised the weapon and went back to the drills. Somewhere to the north, like in the demon-occupied ruins of a city that was still standing despite everything that had been done to it, a hell portal pulsed with quiet regularity. Ranak's contingency, his insurance, his promise that the arithmetic wasn't finished. The icon of sin waited in whatever dimension contained things too large to exist yet. The Doomslayer moved through something, somewhere, doing the work with the absolute commitment of something that had decided once and never revisited the decision. The war eternal had no ending written into it. It had only the next engagement and the preparation for it and the discipline to be ready when it arrived. John Wick had always understood this. He'd just been living it in a smaller universe. He killed men with pencils because the pencil was what was available, and available was enough. And he'd killed a Baron of Hell with 15 rounds of 9mm because 15 rounds was what he had, and what he had was enough. He'd stood in the central chamber of a ritual site with Hell's own energy rewriting his cognition, and named it for what it was, and set it aside, because the work required it and the work was what remained. The Baba Yaga had come to the end of the world and found that the end of the world was, at its core, a professional problem. And professional problems had professional solutions applied with absolute consistency until the work was done. The work was never done. He'd known that before he arrived. He loaded a fresh magazine, raised the weapon, and put 12 rounds through the center of a practice target at 40 meters without adjusting his feet. 12 for 12. He was already improving the ratio. And in this world of endless demons and argent-soaked ruins and a war that had been running since before human memory, the Baba Yaga had found the only thing hell had never prepared for. A man with nothing left to lose who still chose, every morning to be precise. More stories await.